Post-Carbon Institute has undertaken a deep dive analysis of the challenges and opportunities in the transition to 100% renewable energy. And the outcome of that analysis was a book that we published with our friends at Island Press called Our Renewable Future. You can order the book, or you can actually read the whole thing entirely for free online at ourrenewablefuture.org. One of the key takeaways from our analysis is that the transition won't be a plug-and-play substitution. It's going to require us to use energy very differently in all aspects of life. So over recent months, PCI has been hosting discussions with experts in various sectors to explore the post-fossil fuel future. And you can watch recordings of those and sign up for upcoming ones by visiting ourrenewablefuture.org. Ultimately, this future is going to be created by all of us together. And so we want to hear from you too. If you have any questions for our panelists, please ask them in the chat window on your screen. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And if you have any thoughts or ideas or inspirations, please share these by emailing us at orf@postcarbon.org or by tweeting the hashtag Renewable Future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Going to do this very fast. Miya Yoshitani is Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. She has an extensive background in community organizing, campaign strategy, leadership development and training, organizational development and fundraising, and a long history of working in the environmental justice movement. In her 20s, she was the Executive Director of the largest student environmental network in the US, the Student Environmental Action Coalition, and worked broadly in international environmental and developmental networks organizing for environmental and economic justice. He was a participant in the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991 and was on the drafting committee of the original Principles of Environmental Justice, a defining document for the environmental justice movement. And Timothy DenHerder-Thomas is the General Manager of Cooperative Energy Futures. He has a background in energy democracy organizing and social enterprise. Timothy grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey, which helped him make the connections between energy usage, pollution, poverty, social fragmentation, and environmental destruction. Timothy also helped found Grand Aspirations, which supports teams of youth and innovators in 16 cities to create green economic opportunity for themselves and for their communities through innovative energy efficiency and green industry, sustainable food, transit access, and clean energy solutions. Timothy is a co-convener of Minneapolis Energy Options, now called Community Power, which has secured the nation's first city utility clean energy partnership in Minneapolis. Timothy engages in national climate action and energy democracy innovation as an Energy Action Coalition Council member, as a participant in the REAMP network, and as a Minneapolis Global Shaper. So Miya and Timothy, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
So I really want to jump into the conversation that we aim to have, and we will. But I think we have to first at least briefly address the elephant in the room, which was the election of Donald Trump and what it means for the environmental justice and energy transition. So, you know, we're all still processing, but Miya, now that you've had at least a little bit of time to think about it, what are your thoughts?
Let's see, I don't have super organized thoughts aside from wanting to hold my children really close. But I do know that the results of the election are, I think, going to just exacerbate existing inequalities. And that's connected to the way we address our climate issues and connected to the way we need to organize to build this new energy economy. You know, I think there's a lot of things that we've been doing already in this work to prepare for a new democracy, basically, and to kind of organize for reclaiming a democracy. And that's actually fundamentally a piece of how we get to 100% renewable energy, and especially how we get to 100% renewable energy in an equitable way. And there's just no way around it. And so, if anything, the election results have just reinforced my belief about, you know, how important it is to organize, to commit resources to building community organizations, to commit to the leadership of low-income communities and communities of color, and to put that leader in the center of how we build the next economy and how we for it. And we're really going to be, I think, distracted by the fight right now. I think, as we were talking about a little earlier, we're also going to have to make sure that we're maintaining the vision for what we really want at the center of that fight, and make sure that we're not getting distracted by kind of needless fights about stuff that doesn't get our communities closer to the future and the economy and the energy infrastructure that we really want.
Mm-hmm. Timothy, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Tuesday night and yesterday, there was like a little bit of just shock, I think, for a lot of us. But I think what I've really been settling in on is it doesn't change a lot about the long-term course of where we need to go. We have needed to remake our economy, both technologically and materially around clean energy and zero waste and all that, but also structurally around, how do we put power over, who wins, who loses, who makes decisions back into the hands of communities. We've needed to do that for decades, maybe centuries, and we still need to do that. And I think the one thing that I almost have a little bit of excitement about this moment is kind of the surprise of just seeing the extent to which it's really clear that there's a widespread and massive and robust public feeling or sense that the way things have been going is not working, and that's sort of the collapse and end of a dominant paradigm of how the world works and where we're going. And I don't feel very excited about this wave of what people are grasping at as a different alternative. But I think it does mean that we are in an era where people are grasping at new stories, new ways that our world can work. And if we use this opportunity to really build the discipline on the ground and in the community to tell a different narrative, show what it looks like when communities control their own economy, control their own energy, are really building a just and sustainable future, it puts us in a position to really in the future build as the current economics and current politics continues to stagnate and disintegrate. It builds the capacity for people to grab onto something that's a lot more meaningful and deep and long lasting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that to me that is one of the clear signals of this election. When you look at the popularity not only of Trump but of Bernie Sanders as well, there's a populism or a drive towards populism that exists out there. The question is it regressive or progressive? We wound up probably on the wrong side of that, but that doesn't mean the field is, that the fight is over, right? And that people are looking for that, and there's ground to fight on. I guess that's the positive way of looking at it, but it is going to make things harder, right? At least in the near term. Well, there's probably lots more to say about that. I think the conversation is not over, and there's going to be lots of different conversations people are having locally and nationally about what this election means. But there's a mix of folks on the call today, and a mix of people who I think are going to be viewing the recording this later. And I don't want to make assumptions about people's understanding of the importance of looking at justice and equity issues as it relates to the energy transition. So maybe we could just start by talking a little bit about how the kind of existing paradigm, the fossil fuel extraction, production, and consumption system has disproportionately affected poor communities and communities of color. And if either of you have some quick examples that you might want to share, either from the US or globally, just to help people sort of understand the reality of what's been actually happening, not only for decades, but for centuries, but also to the system. So either of you or Miya have any quick response to that question?
Sure, and I'm sure that people who are listening already are be aware, but just to, I guess, kind of outline the main pieces. Like, we refer to the extractive fossil fuel economy as the dig, dump, and burn economy, and in every part of that, digging fossil fuels out of the ground, extracting them out of the ground, processing them, refining, and burning them, and combusting fossil fuels. At every piece of that, you will see that low-income communities, communities of color in the United States, and communities of color all over the world are at the brunt of the burden of that pollution, and also are on the short end of the stick of any economic benefit from that previous dinosaur economy. And I mean, one of the examples that is easy for me to talk about, because we organize in a community, a low-income community in Richmond, California, that's in the Bay Area, just a few miles north of San Francisco. And that community has historically been a refinery community, heavily industrialized. There are several refineries in that area. The main one closest to our community members is the Chevron refinery. Chevron's, of course, one of the largest, most profitable corporations in the history of the world. And Chevron, of course, has many places around the world where it's impacting communities, like in Ecuador or Nigeria, where the development of fossil fuels, where drilling for oil in those places has created both incredible health problems, misery, and also removed indigenous people from lands, from their own land, displaced people. And then in California, on the other end of the pipeline, where that oil is actually being refined, communities like the Laotian refugee community that we organize in, a low-income community, refugees in the area from the mid-'80s, who joined other communities, African American, like a historic Black community that's been there for decades, heavily immigrant and other refugees living in that area, and their neighbor is one of the biggest polluters in the state. And there's incredibly high rates of asthma, other health problems, children who have to be rushed to hospital in the middle of the night because of asthma attacks. They miss school, they miss work, cancer clusters. And in addition to the health problems that are exacerbated by the cumulative impacts of living in a polluted area, because if you have a refinery nearby, you also have other kinds of polluting industry. And if you want to go on the full end of the economy, you'll go all the way to individual consumer use, and how the communities that we work in are the communities that also live next to freeways, and they are overburdened all across the world by the extractive economic impacts. If you live in Richmond, that economy, that local economy, is stuck in this dependency on this major refinery, and it's also displacing other more sustainable economic opportunities for that community. And there are not a plethora of jobs available to community members in that refinery. So they're not benefiting from even the high skill, high wage jobs in the refinery themselves played out in communities across the United States and across the world. And I think that's just one example, but also, you know, a century-old problem that has a solution in our transition, in our just transition to a renewable energy economy.
I think the only thing I'll add, and that was just a really great outline of all the different elements and pieces of the puzzle, is there are sort of two almost like energy watersheds that I like to think about. One of those is, where does the actual energy come from? And you know, here in Minnesota, we can trace the 38% of our energy that is coal back to power plants that are in low-income communities and communities of color that are getting, you know, trains of coal from places that are mined on you know, rural lands, which are low income and tribal, and you know, that all of those cycles. You can trace the nuclear portion of our energy to power plants sited next to native reservations, and uranium that's coming from you know, mining on native reservations. You know, you can tie the natural gas portion to fracking. You can tie the hydroelectric portion to big dams in Manitoba that are flooding out First Nations communities. You know, you can go through all of that, looking at where the energy comes from the energy, from the actual, you know, where is the fuel and where is the burning and where is the transportation and all of that end of it. And just to build out a little bit what Miya was talking about around the economics, I think it's also really useful to think about the financial watershed of where money is going and who does it come from, and looking at the analysis of how much money is leaving low-income communities and communities of color, and really down to the family level. Like, you know, we've done a lot of work in communities here in the Twin Cities, and there are people who are, you know, below poverty line, below even half a poverty line, who are seeing 20 to 30, in some cases even 40% of their entire income being spent to pay for electric and gas bills. And that just does not work when you have to, you know, pay rent and get groceries and medical bills, you know, because these are also the communities that are facing the burden from trash burners and highways and all of those types of things as well. And where is that money going? That money is going to very large companies that are making very high rates of return on what for at least a very long time has been an extremely low risk business. And it's very low job creation. Those jobs are not held by the people who are being most affected or who can pay. And most of the people who are struggling the most with those energy burdens have the least access to, you know, make their home more efficient or install solar panels or, you know, access all the capital that you need to build community microgrids or electric vehicle charging, you know, like all of these, you know, cool technology things. If we've set up the system so that it's sucking money out of the communities that need that capital most and giving the power to control that capital to the people who are not affected, you know, we're going to be in this continued extractive system.
That one area that's I think advantageous for renewables over fossil fuels is it's a two-sided coin, but the distribution of those sources makes it, you know, more difficult to get concentrated energy, but it also makes it more possible for that energy to be owned, you know, by produced by individuals in small communities when we're thinking about particularly solar. So why is it important? I mean, I think you guys touched on this a little bit, but you know, why is it important not only to shift the sources of energy, but also like who owns and controls those sources, and what can we do to to help ensure that it's not also a concentrated wealth situation in terms of renewable energy sources.
I think there's three elements of that I'll just touch on. The first is technological.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So renewable energy is variable and somewhat unpredictable. You can't necessarily control when it's on or off. And therefore, the distribution and networking and spreading of those resources across a broad area is just really important if we actually want a grid that is renewable, that isn't dependent on this dirty polluting energy. And I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to go into the details of microgrids and smart grids and how do we reduce energy losses over transmission lines. But there's a lot of reasons why localizing and distributing power is key. The second reason I would say is political. And just thinking about, this is a huge transition we need to make. And that's not going to happen if it is a trade-off or a fight between people who need energy every day to make ends meet and people who want to solve climate change. That's not going to work. We need to be developing energy in a way where it is directly serving the needs of people who need energy every single day to make ends meet, to make their lives work. You can be in many ways, the most interested leaders in leading the way towards a cleaner economy and healthier air and protection of local economies. And then the third reason I would just identify is more the values or the principles. Renewable energy can be much smaller, it can be much more modular, but so far the majority of the approach to developing clean energy has followed the same economic model, large centralized corporate ownership, and I think it wastes a huge amount of the potential of this transition. It doesn't create jobs where they're needed most. It doesn't reduce energy burdens where it's needed most, and it continues the cycle of people having a relationship to energy that is absentee, that is not engaged, not shaping the future of energy, and that really needs to change.
Thanks. Miya?
Just to emphasize a couple of points that Timothy already made, and add a second one. So the main thing is that there's both a moral and a strategic value to equitable renewable energy transition. And Timothy just described a little bit about what that actually looked like and how that could happen. So small scale distributed local infrastructure that create, high wage, living wage jobs, creating small, resilient and robust energy systems that are distributed that also add value to adapting to the climate of our future, the kind of ensuing climate disaster that's going to require a nimble and robust energy system for local communities, and the opportunity for local ownership and new models of ownership, so that we have this cycle of better health for local communities, and that is an opportunity for, like, it's sort of like we think of renewable energy and equitable renewable energy as the kind of front line of the just transition that is actually there's a whole other constellation
I think we're having issues with Mia's connection right now. I don't know if it's just on my end or other people are experiencing as well.
Yeah, I was having trouble as well.
Yeah, so maybe while his connection gets sorted out, maybe I could just shift it a little bit back to you, Timothy, and ask, what do you think is necessary or should happen in terms of government policy or grassroots efforts that would help ensure that ownership over sources of energy and the benefits of renewable energy and efficiency
to the just transition, and energy is happening.
Mia, unfortunately, I don't know if you can hear me, but we're having technical issues on your end. Hopefully we can sort that out. So Timothy, back to the question I was asking you, thinking about what kinds of grassroots strategies or government policy needs to be put in place to help promote the right kinds of investments, distributed energy, but also ensuring that ownership and benefits, economic benefits are going to communities. Any thoughts about what needs to happen or examples of it happening out there?
Yeah, I think as a general principle or kind of framework for many strategies, there's sort of a set of things about getting the barriers out of the way, and so much of that is creating an incentive system and a access to market system that does not systematically privilege Wall Street investors and large corporate users. And the primary incentives that we have right now nationwide are tax credit based. And if you make your renewable energy projects work based on the use of tax credits, then only very large investors with a lot of taxable income can use them. And there's also various other tax advantages that they have to use those benefits. I think most of the policy strategies that I've found most exciting and useful, not necessarily to even ensuring low-income access and community participation, but just opening up the floodgates to allow it, are mechanisms that create universal access to fair and adequate pricing for renewable energy, and enable ownership structures that allow communities and cooperatives and community-based efforts to participate. So that includes community solar gardens, which are expanding in many states. It includes some really exciting recent work around creating standard prices that utilities have to pay for distributed and community-based renewables, especially not just at the individual property level, but at a community scale where you can get more cost effectiveness. And also mechanisms that allow people to finance energy efficiency and clean energy through their utility bills without personal debt, without credit checks, in ways that are very similar to how the utilities have been requiring us all to finance the building of big dirty power plants. How do we ensure that communities have the same access to that utility billing tool to finance energy improvements for low-income and multifamily buildings, to finance local community solar, all of those types of things. I think I'm going to stop so we can get Miya in again. But I've really just talked about things that get the barriers out of the way, and then there's a whole scope of things about how do we ensure that people of color and low-income people are getting access to that once roadblocks are out.
Welcome back, Miya. Hopefully your connection is working better now. Maybe you could start back from the top in terms of what you were saying, because I think it went out as soon as you started talking.
Oh no. Sorry, you missed my entire, I must have been speaking to myself for about 10 minutes there.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay, I'm sorry. I mean, basically what I started saying was that there's both a moral and a strategic imperative a just transition to 100% renewable energy in an equitable way. And I'm assuming that Timothy just sort of went through and described what some of that infrastructure locally might look like, and maybe what some of the opportunities are for new models of both like hard infrastructure and new models of finance. I'll talk about this strategic imperative for this. What we know is that our communities are actually the base of support for a renewable energy transition. So without massive amounts of grassroots support for this transition, we will not be able to enact the policies that are necessary to actually do the transition in such a way that helps us to really avoid the worst of the climate catastrophe. So what that means is that it's so important for us to be building these models in low-income communities, in communities of color who have been excluded, from the fossil fuel economy, or have been overburdened by the cumulative impacts of the fossil fuel economy. And they have to see these new models working in their neighborhoods. They have to be able to see and actually experience and live in the neighborhoods where this new infrastructure is being built. And they have to see that jobs are actually being created, and that wealth is being created and regenerated and recycled in their communities. So even though that might happen on a smaller scale at first, we need that. We need to invest in local communities, in low-income communities, in particular, most impacted communities have to be invested in first for them to be able to experience and build support for these policies that can actually drive more and more public funds and even private investment into these arenas. So the benefits. I'm sure we've talked about some of the moral imperative to do this. I mean, it's obvious that these are the communities that have been, like what we started out saying, have been overburdened by pollution and have been excluded from economic benefits, and are also at the deep end of growing inequality in our country. And that level of inequality is not good for any of us, and is not good for the level of change that needs to be made. So being able to address that inequality through the infrastructure that we're building is vital. It's essential to building the political support that we actually need. And so I think that our job, even if we think of ourselves as technical experts in building microgrids, or understanding exactly how many parts per million of carbon gets reduced, no matter where we are in the arena of this work, we have to be able to all understand that building the resiliency of organizing in these communities and building power. There's building renewable power, but there's building community voice and power on these issues. We won't be able to do it. We won't be able to do this without that. And so there is a whole political aspect of this that we all need to be concerned about. We can't just leave that to the grassroots or the base building organizations. We all have a part in that.
I would love to get some examples from both of you of any communities that you're seeing or projects that you're seeing that exemplify what we're talking about. But before we get to that, and this is a question actually that somebody raised, relates to sort of the urgency of the climate crisis and the fact that it requires very large-scale policy interventions, and in a lot of cases, people are arguing large-scale technological investments in infrastructure. So how do we balance the urgency of trying to mitigate the climate crisis with trying to, plant seeds in millions of communities and doing that real mobilization work, community to community. So, what's your response to that concern that people have?
I don't think that there's any contradiction between scale and community base. If you're talking about scale and urgency of impact, in fact, I think to flip that idea on its head, I don't think there is a way to get to scale without doing that community-based building. Part of this is just in many industries in the industrial era, and I think part of our thinking about scale is highly influenced by this. Scale meant doing each thing bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's how you got cost effectiveness and impact. That's exactly how we did it with fossil fuel power plants and nuclear plants and all that type of thing, as well as highways and corporations and all these other things that we did. Mm-hmm. And there's this whole new range of technologies, but also community organizations where your scale is not from the size of each thing, it's from the number of things. Renewable energy, there are some basic amounts of kilowatts or megawatts that you want per system. It doesn't have to be huge. The real cost effectiveness is from doing it millions of times. And that's where we need to get. We need to get to a place where every community is building these types of projects. There's standardized processes for doing it. It's not that difficult for every community to do all the legal and financing work, as if it was the first time. To standardize that, and so you sort of have almost like I don't quite want to call it mass production, but kind of a consistent rollout of a lot of these very individually small community scale energy developments that different organizations and different communities are leading and putting together, that together are massive. And part of the promise of renewable energy is that you can do each of those projects extremely quickly. Building a fossil fuel power plant takes 10 years. Building a solar project takes 4 months. You could ramp up the scale much more quickly once we have actually built that robust grassroots network. And I think there is some delay in building that network and some patience that's required. But I think part of the question, I think this goes back to what we just saw with the election, what other viable pathway do we have to get to scale than by doing deep grounded community organizing and getting lots of people and lots of organizations to the place where they're ready to do these types of projects everywhere.
Miya, anything to add?
I think everything that Timothy just said. There's no contradiction between scale and the urgency. In fact, I think what we've learned from the past decade is that we've been, in the name of addressing urgency, we've been doing it wrong. And I want to say that on both an infrastructure level as well as on a political level. And those two things are clearly related. And if we are only reinforcing, like rebuilding an energy system in the image of the previous energy system, and just trying to keep doing that, like beating our heads against that wall, we are going to hit the same dead end that we hit with the attempt to get a federal climate bill that was DC-centric, DC-based, and was absolutely a response to time and urgency. And now here we are. How many steps backward have we taken? So I believe often that people who refer to this urgency as basically as a smokescreen for their lack of creativity for something that's different and something that's both different and necessary. And I just don't, I think we have to get our heads out of the sand in this case. And if it takes slowing down for a couple months to try to figure it out, then that is well worth it, because with this question, or like the insistence on needing to just keep building things the same way we already know how to build them, even though they're not getting us the results that we need, you know, that's slowing us down more than anything.
Well said. So what are some examples that you guys have of communities that are getting this right, whether they're at a full community scale or projects in communities? And by getting it right, I mean building that distributed renewable energy, you know, production, but also doing it in a way where ownership is empowered, really rests in the hands of the community. And there's a question we have from someone around, you know, how do you gauge lower income and what they call the end of the pipe communities that have been left behind and been disenfranchised? So any particular examples of groups, organizations, or communities that have actually really gotten people who've been left out of the process really involved in the process? So what comes to mind? What's inspiring for you guys?
Well, I think there's a number of communities that are part of, I'll mention a particular organization called the Climate Justice Alliance that has, we're one of the members, one of the founding members of the Climate Justice Alliance, but there are members all over the country. One, for example, is Black Mesa Water Coalition. They're an organization based in Black Mesa, Arizona, in the Navajo reservation there. And they've been dealing with all sides of the extractive economy and the renewable energy economy by, they've helped to close down some of the, or one of the Peabody coal fire plants. And they have a number of both coal fire electricity generating plants and coal mines located in the Navajo reservation. And what they're doing is both organizing to sort of end the part of the extractive economy that has been so harmful to their community there, but they're also building new distributed renewable energy systems for residents and Navajo Nation members, tribal members who have never even had electricity on their reservation. You know, there's a number of homes that have never even had the benefit of being hooked up to the grid because it's non-existent on the reservation. And you know, they're also looking at using some of the existing infrastructure from the past power plant to do some utility scale that's community owned, which is really exciting. And then you have folks in Eastern Kentucky, like Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, who have been for decades, you know, aggressively fighting for a transition from the coal industry, and they're building new finance models for energy efficiency and for benefits to the community through renewable energy and other forms of like economics, new economic models for local businesses that can really help make the just transition for community members who have been so dependent on the past and on the ups and downs of the coal industry. Those are a couple examples. Even, or another example that's an urban example is in Los Angeles. Community members who fought and won a feed-in tariff with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Energy, who have a feed-in tariff that's now specifically for multifamily units in low-income neighborhoods. And they've also spent years working with local labor unions to create a workforce development pipeline for young people who are able to kind of participate in the energy efficiency and renewable energy economy that's now being energized by these new investments. So, and there's other places, there's Buffalo, New York, there's places here in Oakland and in Richmond, here in New York State. I feel like there are examples all over the country where they're taking the communities are taking a piece of both ending parts of the damaging extractive economy and creating models that work in those local communities, because they're not all going to be the same. They're going to be as different as each of our communities is. And that's one of the beauties of small scale, distributed, equitable, renewable energy, is that it's adaptive to different community needs.
Thanks. Timothy, what comes to mind for you in terms of examples and inspiration?
Yeah, there are so many examples all around the country, and I think I hit on a lot of really good ones. I think just to tell a specific story, I can talk just briefly about the pieces we're pulling together in North Minneapolis around our community solar garden at Shiloh Temple. And this is in the context of a emergence of community solar as a model in Minnesota that's supposed to create universal access to affordable solar energy for really everyone. That's his original intent. But the vast majority of development so far in the States has been large rural projects, most of which don't even serve residents. They serve big corporations and cities. And the small number that do serve residents, as far as I know, all of them except what we do are limited to people with high credit scores, which makes it very hard for anyone to participate. We've been developing this project in collaboration with Shiloh Temple, which is a Black church in Minneapolis, and a number of community-based organizations that are working on economic justice in general, and also specifically on the environmental justice issues in Northside, particularly around stopping the expansion of and eventually shutting down the trash burner that's in the community. And a huge piece of that project is really working with the community both to really understand, because at least in Minnesota, solar energy is not a thing that has really happened for low-income communities.
You just lose Timothy.
Oh no!
This is the curse of technology. Well, hopefully he can get back, and we can jump back into from you. So I had two kind of big remaining questions, which each could probably take a long time to cover. But one is, when you actually envision the future, we talked about this a little while ago. When we envision the future, what is that vision for you? What's the vision of when we reach 100% renewable energy? What does that look like? And then the second question is, for folks who are on the call right now, or viewing or recording this later, what would you encourage them to be doing right now to support this transition, to ensure that it's just and equitable and as rapid as possible? I know those are two very big questions.
Yeah, but we've only got 8 minutes left, so I'll try to
Okay,
I'll try to do it quickly. I mean, I think we've already described a lot of what the infrastructure kind of could look like on the ground. Small scale, distributed, local infrastructure that's robust and resilient in the face of climate change, that has different models of ownership, and that actually combines energy efficiency and storage. And so there's all those pieces to it. I think that the bigger kind of more visionary part of what we're talking about is that renewable energy done equitably can be an equity multiplier in the face of climate change, which we refer to as a threat multiplier to equity. And energy efficiency and renewable energy done in a way that we've been talking about has a way of both like protecting communities from the impending impacts of climate change, as well as addressing some of the key inequalities that exist in communities right now. I mean, that's our basic vision. But when you think about it, I also wanted to say that we're talking about energy and renewable energy as part of an integrated system in local communities, and that it's part of new food systems, water systems, housing, transportation, adaptive infrastructure, zero waste, and that it's part of that integrated system of an integrated approach to a just transition that has at its core these values of returning control and democratic control to communities, and engaging as much participation and self-determination as possible. And that's part of how you make a really robust local economy and robust local democracy. That is absolutely what is needed in this political moment in particular. But for us to get to the transition of our energy system and economy that's needed to address the bigger problem. And so, it includes new visions for participation, for engagement, and for deeply valuing the leadership and the solutions coming from local communities who have been the most impacted.
Thanks. Sorry, we lost you there for a minute, Timothy. What you were talking a little bit about what you're doing there in Minneapolis, and maybe you could finish that. But I also, be mindful of time, 5 minutes left. I wanted to ask both of you what your vision was for the future. Trying to keep that vision in mind as something to work towards. But then also, what can people do now who want to support, and be part of ensuring that this transition happens quickly and is also done in a just and equitable way?
Well, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Just to really quick finish up what I was saying, and I'll summarize. We've essentially put together a cooperatively owned community solar garden that is going to provide full power needs to about 35 households, primarily in North Minneapolis, for the next 25 years, at an immediate discount that also locks in prices over time. So it's saving people money right away, and also saving people a lot more money in the long run. We've also built out a job training portion of that, where it's equipping people from the community to do work in the solar industry, and providing a jobs pipeline through the contracts that we require in our installations. And there's a bunch of other pieces just around how that's now triggering a lot more projects coming in. Speaking to the broader vision, I see a future where the vast majority of energy is not only produced in but owned by the communities that use it, and that's coming from renewable resources, where we've used all the efficiency tools that we have to dramatically ramp down how much energy is used as a whole, but also that energy is no longer this one-way street of energy gets pumped in, dollars get pumped out, and instead it's a relationship, it's a network, it's people coming together and working together to provide and build and create and manage and build wealth from the energy system that is the foundation to all those other economic sectors. In terms of what people can do right now, I'd say the first and easiest thing is find a local community organization or community group that's already doing this work and figure out what they need. To the extent that in some communities there aren't robust groups working on this yet, find other community members and find existing organizations that are doing related work to hitch onto or start something new. Ultimately, in many states and many regions, we don't yet have the legal and ownership models in place. And so there's just a wealth of work around new policy and public utilities commission programs and working at the city level to challenge utility control that is very different in different communities. But starting at the grassroots is the place to start.
Thanks. Well, we're just about at time. I wish we could talk actually for quite a bit longer, and I apologize everyone for the technical issues we had. Any closing thoughts that you want to share me at this point, or you, Timothy, before we say goodbye to folks?
Sure. Yeah, a couple of quick things. One, in terms of what people can do, I would say one really important thing is to support key fights where there is a, where the conflicts of communities are coming into the ending of the extractive fossil fuel system. For instance, supporting Standing Rock, folks in Standing Rock, and the water protectors there, and supporting their vision, which may be just right now the focus in the media is just about the end of the pipeline. That community has a whole vision for itself on the transition that it wants to make and control. And so I think that's one thing. The other thing is, really investing in rebuilding local democracy. Is that like in this moment, we can't emphasize that anymore. That that needs to be impressive and robust, and there needs to be a huge commitment to that. And we just need folks to also be moving resources into the places where these new models need to be built. So those are the three things that I would recommend.
All right, thanks. Timothy, any closing thoughts you want to share?
I think I'll leave it. There's so much, and I think we're in kind of a birthplace of a birth moment of energy democracy work. I mean, it's been going on in many communities for a long time, but I think it is now in a moment of going into mainstream, and I think having many more people digging into that work, that's what we need.
Yeah, I think you touched on this earlier that this is an inflection point, and that birth of something new can be painful and difficult, and we might be there. So there's lots of opportunity for engagement, and it clearly comes back to the local, the community level. Though we can't disengage obviously from what's happening nationally and internationally, but it seems like there's lots of need and opportunity to be engaged locally, and a lot of benefits that people get from engaging on that level that are far beyond just thinking about kilowatts and use and those kinds of things. So I want to thank you both for all the work that you guys do and for taking time out of your busy schedule for having to have this conversation. And I want to thank folks who participated in it. There's going to be a recording up soon, which we'll be sharing with folks. And I want to also thank the folks that took the time to add in comments. There are a lot of interesting comments that were added and some questions that we weren't able to get to. So just want to thank everyone for participating, and then keep chins up and keep plugging away at things, okay?
All right,
Thanks, everybody.
thanks.
Thanks, everyone.